Hello fellow crafters, I'm Karen, and this is the first video in the Peppermint Christmas series. In this video you'll see how to make this combination of 3 wrapped peppermint candies out of wood and fabric. To see all of the Peppermint Christmas videos that I have, you can see the combination video linked in the description below. This peppermint craft is just taking the idea of a peppermint and blowing it up, making it just plain old larger. So in this we're going to be creating a sort of trio of peppermint mantle decorations that will stand up on edge, and they'll be wrapped in a fabric similar to tulle, and it will look like, hopefully, the candy wrapper when we're done. And for this craft then you'll need the supplies that are on the screen here. And I used 3/4 inch plywood as the base shape of the peppermints. It doesn't need to strictly be that thickness, but it does need to be thick enough that it can stand on edge without doing too much wobbling. So the more wobbly place you're going to keep it, the thicker your board is going to need to be. The fabric that I chose to use is called crepon, and it's very thin, but similar to tulle. It's a little bit fancier looking, almost like it belongs in a formal dress. And I'm going to be hemming the edge of it using 1/2 inch width white ribbon. So it doesn't specifically matter what fabric or ribbon you use for this, but it should be something that is see-through enough to see your peppermint piece behind it, but also weighty enough to hold the candy wrapper sort of shape. And then I'm just going to be using basic craft paint and a layer or 2 of varnish just to keep the surface nice. So I have to catch you up a little bit on the steps that I've already done, or actually that my dad has done on my behalf. You'll be starting off with just a sheet of plywood, but that step has already been done, and we just measured out an 8-inch diameter circle and a 6-inch diameter circle, and then a 4-inch one. And you want to make sure that you don't leave it just as a circle because it will just roll. You need to cut one flat edge so that it can stand up on edge. And however many of these you do doesn't particularly matter. That's really up to your decorating preference. But I would recommend that you use an odd number because it typically looks better to see an odd number of objects than it does to see an even number of objects. So it helps balance it visually. So whatever it is, make it an odd number and cut out as many as you'd like. I just wanted a big, a medium, and a little one, so those are the sizes I went with. I believe my dad used a bandsaw to cut these out, but whatever saw you end up using should be fine. I just used then a 120 grit sandpaper to smooth off the faces and the edges, and I did use an orbital sander to do that so that I wouldn't have to sand for ages by hand. I had to take a decent bit of wood off of the surface just to clean it up because I wasn't looking for an especially nice piece of wood since I'm going to go ahead and put paint all over it. So once you have your smooth wood, and I would recommend you brush it off with like a chip brush or blow it off with an air compressor or something. Once you have those, what you need to do will be to paint the whole surface white. And the peppermint concept is obviously alternating white and red, but it's way easier to paint red on top of white than it is to paint white on top of red. And it's easier to paint the whole thing in one of the colors and then add the stripes as opposed to trying to paint a stripe and a stripe and a stripe and a stripe in alternating colors. So what I'm going to do first is just paint front, back, and sides in white. And it's going to take, I would guess, 2 to 3 coats of craft paint since it doesn't go on very thick. And I do have knots in here in the wood. So one thing to note about knots is that they have the potential to impact the final color that you see, especially if your paint goes on thin. Sometimes you'll see discoloration in-painted cabinets and things like that because you can see the knots through. I'm not too worried about that for this project, so I'm just going to put on a couple of coats of paint and hope that it doesn't impact for a while. The nice bit about the craft paint, it's hard to say, is that it does dry really quickly. So I'm going to start actually on the bottom edge so that it has time to dry first, and then I can set it up on this edge if I need to while it's drying. I'm just going to go across the front and the sides and then the back, and then I'll move on to the next one. I'm thinking that by the time I go through each of these, the paint will have dried on the first one, and I can just go back and do the next coat. I'm just going to set that aside and let that dry so that I've got a nice drier surface to work with. The first one's still a little bit wet, so I need to give it a little bit of time to dry, which means I'm going to wash the paint off my hands. But what you can see from, I guess I'll show you this one, is what one coat of paint looks like. Not really enough to cover sufficiently, so definitely needs a second coat. Okay, so this is what it looks like after 2 coats. This is the biggest knot that I have. It's not bad. You could probably quit at 2. I'm going to go ahead and do a 3rd coat, just to be thorough. It's still slightly damp, but the paint doesn't come off on my fingers, which is basically how I'm judging whether I can do the next coat or not. While those are drying, because I want them to dry fairly well before I put the red paint on, just to make sure there's no mixing of paints on the surface, I'm going to go ahead and start figuring out what size I need to cut the fabric to so that it can be wrapped around each piece and sort of cinched together on the sides to make the wrapper. So I know that I have an 8-inch diameter as my largest one, and it looks like it's about 7.5 from top to the edge. So I've got 7.5 inches vertically, 3/4 inch thickness on both sides, so that's 7.5 for front and back. 3/4 inch twice is 1.5, so that's 16.5 inches in width to just barely go around top to bottom and then meet the other edge. And I think I want to have at least 3 inches overlap just for good measure, and that will help too with the reality of it, where plastic wrapper would go around and overlap. It doesn't just meet. So I'm just going to round up basically. So I'm just going to add 3.5 inches of overlap, which gets us to 20 inches in width. So then the opposite, the sideways direction, I know I have an 8-inch width, and I think I want it to stick out a good 4 inches. I'm trying to see if that makes sense in scale, that it's half of the shape. That seems to be about right. So if I want half out on either side, it just means I have to double the width, which would make this, I did not draw this to scale. I hate it when I don't draw things at least the right orientation of a rectangle. So I actually need 20 inches around, 16 inches wide for that largest peppermint. And then I need to add a seam allowance of sorts just to hem the edges. It's really a hem length. So my ribbon's actually 5/8 of an inch wide, and it's going to be folded in half over the edge. And I'm thinking it would be wise to fold the fabric over inside the ribbon, and makes most sense to fold it and then fold it under so that that edge doesn't stick out at all, which means I would need to leave exactly the 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to add another 1/2 inch on every side, which means that in the end it needs to be 21 by 17. And I realized that this ribbon is there's only 9 feet of it, which is not very much. I should have checked that in the store. So make sure that you get enough ribbon to do all your edges. But 21 twice is 42. 17 twice is 34. That's 76 inches. That's disappointing. So, I mean, that's over 6 feet. I might have to use a different ribbon or get more ribbon to be able to do the 2 smaller ones. But let's put that aside for now. Check our paint. Still a little bit damp. So I'm going to go ahead and do the math for the other 2 real quick here. So I have about a little over 5 inches. Plus my 1.5 inches. Front and back is 10, so it's 11.5. And I'm just going to do 2 inches overlap on this one. Maybe 1.5 inches. No. A lot of air on the upper side. So let's do 2.5 inches, which is 14. And then add 1 inch for seams. So that's 15 inch to go around the middle-sized peppermint, and the width would be 6 inches plus 6 inches, so 12. And then my third one is just over 3.5. So 3.5 twice is 7, plus 1.5 inches is 8.5. We'll add 1.5 inches for this one. Which is 9, 10, plus seam makes it 11 inches, and 4 inches wide plus 4 inches is 8 inches. Alright, so I need 168 inches. That's annoying math. How many feet is that? $14. That's a shame. I only have 9. Time to check the paint. It's getting there. And it really only has to be dry on, like super dry, on the side that's going to get the red paint. And this side is pretty dry. Let's check these. That seems dry. Also very close. So it's just curing on that last side that I painted. So the next step will be to paint the red stripes onto the peppermints, which will make it actually look very pepperminty. And I toyed around with several designs, just in looking at pictures on the internet of different peppermint drawings, and I watched actual peppermint, how to make peppermint candy videos, and other peppermint crafts. And basically I've noticed a few features as far as the striping goes. Again, with the odd numbers, it looks better when there are an odd number of the red stripes. So in total it would be an even number of stripes, but the red looks better in 3s and 5s than it does in 4s and 6s. So I've decided to go with 5s, at least for the large ones. I think I'll probably be consistent all the way down to the smallest one and do it in 5s, which means I need to mark out 1/5 of the circle. So you could use a protractor and do it at mark it at 72 degrees, or you could measure around the circumference of the circle and mark every consistent, well, divide your circumference by 5 and mark every interval there, which is probably what I'm going to do here since I don't have a protractor. And what I'm going to do is a wide stripe and 2 very narrow stripes, just like a line on either side, kind of spaced out a little bit from the wider stripe, just to add a little bit of fanciness to it, basically. And the other thing is, you could do just wedges, like triangles, which is easier to mark and easier to make exact. But the ones that I found that look a little bit fancier, that I prefer, have a bit of a swirl in the stripe. And to do that with paint it just requires that you sketch out in advance what you're going to do. So what I'm going to do is measure out my 5th markings and just sketch. I just practiced a little bit of the sketching on paper in advance, and I'll sort of sketch a little bit of a swirl in the peppermint stripe, and I'll need to find the middle so that all of my stripes find the middle of the circle, and then I'll mark those in pencil, mark my little narrow side stripes, and then go ahead and paint those. So I'm going to start here with the biggest one. I think this is pretty dry. And you'll have the option, too, of whether you want to paint the back and the front, or just the front. If you paint the back, it can be placed in an area that is where you might see the back. If you don't, just put it up against the wall so nobody sees that. I would probably paint front and back because I just want it to be more complete. And I'm going to also throw a coat of varnish on after that. But getting ahead of myself. So I have my measuring tape here. I think it's going to be easier since I'm working with 5s. It's easier to use the centimeters than it is to use the inches, because if I use the centimeters, 5ths are easier to take out of 10 than they are to take out of 8. So I'm just approximating the remainder of the circle to be about there. And for math's sake, I'm going to make it actually here, because that is 66 centimeters. And I suppose I ought to find the center here. So 66, change colors here on my whiteboard. I need 66 over 5. So that'll be 13, right? Yeah. 13.2. And it doesn't matter exactly where your stripes start and stop. I'm going to make my first one kind of in the corner here. And all I'm doing is measuring around to the 13 centimeter mark and to intervals of 13 after that, so 26. And I'm just making very small pencil markings because if I'm wrong for some reason, I want to be able to go back. So 39. And 52. Oh, I forgot the point 2. Drat. Well, I can make up for the point 2 over there. See? This is why I use tiny pencil marks. Retreat. We'll just make that 13.2 instead. And I need 26.4. And then 39.6. And then 52.8. And then my 66 point. This is going to be tricky because I don't actually have that part of the circle to work with. I'm going to say it's thereabouts. And now I need my center. So I'm looking for, well, this is 8 1/4. No, I can't do it that way, of course. That's 8 almost 1/4. It's not a perfect circle, so I'm not even looking for perfect measurements here. That seems about right, though. So if I mark that center point, just double check it over here. Yeah, that's about center. This is not quite dry. It is sticking to my Lazy Susan. Seems to be okay though, so all is well. So, let me grab my drawing quick here. This is where I had started. This is kind of what I'm aiming for. This is a different design. And it's not much of a curve, but it is a bit of a curve. So I'm just going to sketch these from here. You could probably do some involved math to try and make it really exact, or print out something to be a template and then cut it out and then trace it on. But from what I saw from real candy making, it's very inexact because it's just like how the candy material moves. So there's a curve. And I'm going to try and just draw exactly the same thing. I made it kind of a little steeper of a curve towards the outside and a narrower curve at the inside. I'm going to try to do exactly the same thing 4 more times from my same measurement point. Roughly right. Still roughly right. I'm going to skip that one that's on the edge because it's weird. And basically, I start, I know kind of where I want the outer side of the curve to be, and then I look at the center and just make sure that I end up in the center. So I'm going to imagine that there's a point out here. And there's roughly 5ths. And now I need to make a slightly wider. So I'm going to actually measure this. This is actually a chord, not the arc length. And I'm going to go slightly less than half of this. It's 4 3/4. 2 1/2 is probably about right. Which is slightly more than half. Maybe I'll bump it down. 2 1/4. Okay, so I'm going to mark 2 1/4 from each of my original marks. Again, fairly approximate. This is arts and crafts, not rockets. Again, estimating where that curve would be. I don't even know that I can mark anything over there. I'm going to estimate my curve over here. The important part is that the ones that you can measure and make exact, or more exact, you just need to make the ones that you can't sketch look like they blend in with the other ones. So I'm going to try and draw basically the same curve and meet back in the center again. And this is, I'm actually doing probably a slightly more shallow curve. Yeah, that's very acceptable. And since I'm going to be painting this, I'm going to actually mark with just a little tiny X the insides of these so I don't get confused about where the red needs to go. It would be very sad if I painted the wrong things. So I've left the white areas slightly larger than the red areas so far. And now I'm going to I'm just going to eyeball these. I'm not going to measure. I'm going to do a line that's trying to stay parallel here at the outside and then comes to the center. And it's just going to be on the outsides of where the red stripes will be. And I personally find it much easier to sketch all this in pencil rather than try to be accurate freehanding it with a paintbrush. And you kind of have to be willing to stick with whatever you pencil in. So if you're really nervous about it, you might be better off making a template. Although I will say that I tried to think through doing this with a template, and I had a hard time really figuring out how to create this shape. And when I decided that the shape would be hard to make, I solidly gave up on that plan and thought it would be better to just freehand it. So here we are. We've got nice set of peppermints. And I think I am going to go ahead and paint the red on this one, the first coat at least, and just make sure I like how it looks before I go and mark up my other two. So I'm using red apple paint, but it really doesn't matter as long as it's red. This one was just called white. And I'm going to alternate using a wider brush to paint the big stripes and then a very skinny brush to do the little stripes. And I'm just going to work in a circle because I need to have my hand not go on paint at the end. So I'm going to start, in fact, on this stripe so that by the time I work my way around, I've got a place to put my hand. And I don't use any like special paintbrushes, and I'm kind of bad with my paintbrushes and maintaining them what would probably be properly. So I buy cheap brushes that I can dispose of when they get into bad shape. So I'm not using anything special or fancy here. I just used a foam brush for the white paint and some basic acrylic brushes for the red paint. I always lick them a little, just to get a nice little point. Here we go. And I'm thinking it's going to be better not to operate on something that moves when I'm trying to be precise. So, away with the Lazy Susan for this bit. So that's what it looks like with one coat of red. I think I'm going to go back and do a second coat of red on just the large stripes after I wash this brush, just to kind of fill in some of the shading. It doesn't look quite full in color. And then I just have to work around the outsides so the edges match, and then do the back. Lather, rinse, repeat, but I am quite happy with how it turned out. I think it looks good. And there is the difference between one coat and 2 coats of red paint on those stripes. I'm much happier with that. It looks very full in color. So now all that I need to do is I'm going to use a pencil and just try to draw straight lines down from the edges of this, paint the edges, and then I can draw the equivalent peppermint on the other side. After that, I can go ahead and paint the other 2 smaller ones, which will go a little faster because they're smaller, which is nice, because this is very time consuming. After that, we'll regroup and do the fabric wrappers. And for good measure, so I don't forget before I varnish, I'm going to try and erase what I can of this mark. That's one of my approximations of the curve. And that's mostly gone. Definitely not noticeable. On to the painting. I have completed the painting on the peppermints now. I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. I did make one decision different than I had planned, which is just that my rational side reminded me that it's really not necessary to paint the backs, so I didn't, just for the time that it would take to do all of that painting. So I just painted the fronts and the sides, you can kind of see that, and I'm going to add a coat of varnish, and then while the varnish is drying, I will go ahead and start working on the candy wrapper, which is the fabric. Having realized that I only had 9 feet on this spool of ribbon, went looking for another spool, and they didn't have in stock the same ribbon, which is sad because I had really liked this one for kind of a balance between kind of almost sheer, which looks more fancy, but enough meat to it that I could feel confident sewing into it that it wouldn't pull apart in any way. So I did just find a different type of ribbon, and there are 21 feet on this spool, so I'll use this to hem the edges of my rectangles. So, coat of varnish, I'm going to be starting on the back so that when I flip them over, if it's still slightly wet at all and there's any damage to the surface of the varnish, that it won't be on the front. If you want to be really careful about it, you can always just paint the one side, let it fully dry, and then paint the other side, but I'm trying to move a little bit faster than that, so I'm just going to go ahead and do the back first. And I'm using, this is a matte varnish. It's called, it's from Deco Art brand. It's called Duraclear Matte Varnish. And it just provides a nice little coat of protection to the surface of it. You can get a satin varnish as well, which I've used for other projects, and that just makes it a little bit shinier on the surface. But I'm going for a more matte surface here. And I'm just using a foam brush to put it on. Although I have found in using a foam brush for this in the past that sometimes it leaves behind bits of the foam. So if you do find that that's happening on your surface, you'll just want to switch to a brush that uses bristles instead. And it is a challenge to see on the surface, so I'm holding this up so that the light reflects so I can see where I've painted the varnish on and see where I have yet to paint. And this goes on really quick, really thin. And you could do a second coat if you want it to be more durable, but I'm just doing this as kind of a good measure to make sure that there's a little bit of protection on there. But I'm not worrying about real durability to this, given that it's a once-a-year seasonal decoration. I have done projects where I've done 2 coats, and it's the same process with the second coat. It goes on nice and smooth and clear. It's even harder to see where you've painted, but it does provide a greater surface protection. So I'm just making sure I check around the edges to make sure that I've made it all the way up to the edges. You don't want to go super thin, but you also don't want to go super thick. So it should kind of smooth out over the surface that you've painted. It shouldn't look drippy, but it should cover all of it. So if you see spots that look dry that you just put the varnish on, you probably didn't really get much varnish there, and you should go back. I'm starting to see little bits of foam coming off, but I'm really close to the end of this, so I'm just going to push through. Okay, that looks nice. And actually the beginning of where I started is already looking more dry than when you first put it on. If I check my first one I painted here, it's almost dry to the touch already, and it's only been a couple minutes. So it won't take long for that. I am going to rinse out this brush and switch to a bristle one for the front faces, and then as these dry, I'll put them aside and start cutting my crepon fabric. Okay, so per the math that I did when I was waiting for paint to dry, I need a 17 by 21 inch, and a 12 by 15 inch, and an 8 by 11 inch section. I have not ironed this, as is very obvious, and I may need to, since this is holding a lot of wrinkle from where I had it folded. But I'm going to go ahead and cut the pieces, or at least cut the first piece, and then I'll test the ironing on one piece before ironing all of them. So when I was selecting this fabric, it really boiled down to, sorry, I need something to hold this on the table. Not sufficient. I just wanted something that was see-through enough that you would be able to see the peppermint, but also be kind of pretty. And this crepon fabric is very similar to organza, and it's kind of in the tulle family. So it's that sheer looking fabric, and I'm actually wondering as I look at it how well you'll be able to see, but you can see my hand through it pretty well. So it's time to cut, measure and cut. Let's make sure that stays. Very annoying. And this does fray on the edges, so that's why I'm adding the ribbon. And I'm not worrying about a perfect square here. You're not going to be able to tell once I cinch the edges. But you want to get as close as you can to square. I mean, if it looks like a rhombus when you're done, that's not gonna be easy to work with. So as with all fabric, you have to take off that side. And it would be easier to use a rotary cutter here, but I'm just going to go ahead and use scissors. And I'm just going to straighten this edge a little. It looks like it was folded over when they cut it at the store. I'm just thinking here, it does seem to have a direction to it, almost. It's not quite a nap per se, but it looks kind of like there are threads that go side to side this way. So I'm going to keep that horizontal. If I were to turn this 90 degrees, it would look vertical in the final product. I don't think I want that. So there's my 17. I gotta go up 21. It would probably be easier to do all of this measuring and cutting, having ironed first, but I would imagine that not everyone has rotary cutting tools, and it certainly can be done with scissors, and I don't have to get out more tools this way. So I think what I'm going to do is sort of fold this. No, right, I'm not going to be able to do that because it's not a perfect square. I'm going to measure across 17. The fabric's being very squirrely. And you can actually see that marking on this fabric, which is slightly surprising. So I'm just going to cut and try to end up there. Mostly just keeping my eye on where I need to end up more than anything else. I was close. If you're not very confident about your ability to cut a straight line, and I grant this is not exactly straight, it even did some weird stuff there. If you're not confident, then you can always just mark it properly. I'm just trying to save time. And my edges are a little crooked, but it's also really hard to work with in this very wrinkly form. So I'm going to go try to take an iron to this. And you want to use a really, really low setting with something like this, because you do not want to burn the fabric. So hopefully I don't come back sad. Success! Much flatter. Definitely reveals any lack of squareness in my cutting. Just folding a little to scope it out. I'm not sure what happened on there. That was me not cutting a very straight line. Let's just cut back. I don't want to do it that way. This one edge is just so frightfully crooked that I'm going to fix it. And I'm just going to go roughly in parallel with the other side. Ooh. Now I have bumped the other side. Alright. Much closer. And close enough. So, in the end, this will get wrapped around like so, and cinched up here to become a candy wrapper. Boy, this stuff wrinkles easily. So, that's alright. It irons really easily too. So, I will need my ribbon cut as well, and I'm going to do 2 more of these. So I'm going to set this one aside. Measure out my other 2. I'm wondering if it's really worth ironing in advance. It's so crinkly right here. It was just folded badly. Probably why my last one ended up crinkly, but I'm just going to go for it. Now I've got 3 pieces of organza, or not organza, crepon, I want to clean up the edges of this just a little bit if needed. That's not too bad. Also not bad. It looks a little wonky on that corner, but that's okay. And those edges are a little rough. Close enough. So I just want to do a little bit here. It's so hard to tell. This fabric moves around so fluidly. It's really hard to tell where things are right or wrong. So I think this corner looks like it sticks out a little. And this one, by the same token, depending on where it is at any given moment. Oh, this is the long one, so I'm going to just take off this. Try to square it up. Much better. Alright, in hindsight, probably would have been better to just iron at the beginning. But that's alright. I have learned. Probably a fruitless effort to try and cut off these little fraying bits. Looks kind of like really tiny tinsel. And the next step will be to cut the ribbon and then hem the ribbon around the edges. And again, I'm going to do a piece and then make sure that it looks okay. And I did end up with another 5-inch, or 5/8 of an inch width ribbon. And it's going to end up going along each edge and folding over. I'm going to go ahead and measure. There's no trick to this, it's just measure and cut. So I'm going to cut all of these and then show you what I'll do for the hemming. There, that's satisfying. Got all of the edges to be hemmed for 1, 2, 3 rectangles, and I think I'm going to start on the smallest one. Now, it doesn't particularly matter what order I do these in, but I'm going to do the longer sides and then the shorter sides for each of these. And given how easy this folds, I'm actually going to use the hemming tool. This is an easy hem bit. It just allows you to sort of go down like this and then fold your fabric over the edge so you can iron it in place. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that for 1/4 inch. So I'm going to do the 1/2 inch first because it'll be easier to hold and be accurate. And then I'll fold that underneath itself and give it a last little ironing. And it will be pinned. And I might as well then also, I'm just going to fold these in half and iron them flat so that I'm not fighting any ribbon or fabric to do the hemming. So I'm going to go do the 4 pieces and 4 edges for this piece and come back and show you. But before I do that, I want to varnish the fronts of the pieces so that it has lots of time to dry while I do the sewing and hemming. Coming at it with a bristled brush this time, and the backs of this are well dried, so I'm going to do the tops and then the sides. Two things to just note here as I'm finished with this one. If you do have any areas, like I have some spots here where the plywood split and there are gaps in the edges, keep an eye out for spots like that because your varnish can get pooled there and then drip as it dries. So just try to limit how much gets in there. And then the other thing was just, what was the other thing? The other thing was just that there's a very slight pinkness to the varnish, not naturally, but just because it's picked up some of the red paint. I would just comment that if you see that, it's not a big deal, but it does help to move kind of quickly across things so the paint doesn't have time to get wet, and then it might risk getting into your varnish. So that is the last one done here, and the first one I'm going to move off of my drying. Oh yeah, I'm actually going to need that. Yeah, this one's dry too. Just going to let that finish drying and wash my brush and start hemming. Alright, so I have pinned the first 2 sides of this. I did the long sides as planned. Looks like this. And all I did was use my hemming tool to fold over 1/2, and then I folded it sort of underneath on itself again to get down to that 1/4 inch, and then sort of smushed it into the ribbon which I had ironed. And the fabric was a little squirrely in there. It's kind of springy, so it didn't want to go in. So I really did have to go 1 pin at a time and just sort of smush the fabric in the ribbon with that double fold, and then put a pin in, and then keep going on and on. So let's check on these. Those are feeling dry. So I am going to sew the long edges here, and then do the same process with the short edges. And then after that, I'm going to proceed to the next 2 larger pieces, and I'll check back in when I'm ready to wrap it around. And this is very concerning. Oh, nope, not concerning. It goes this way. Just checking. So it'll look sort of like this. But I'll gather up these edges so I get a little bit sticking out. It looks like this is a little narrower than I kind of had imagined, but that's alright. There's no exact right plan, but I do like the way this looks on the outside of here. So I've skipped ahead a little here, so you didn't have to watch me iron and hem and sew for the roughly 3 hours or so that I spend on it. The final product is here, and I have to explain one change that I ended up making. I realized that I did my math wrong at the beginning. That's why they say measure twice, cut once, but it really ought to be think 3 times measure twice, cut once. The basic issue is that when I when I was first doing the calculations to figure out how big the fabric needed to be, I did fine with the, over the top, overlap some, that measurement. That measurement was fine. The trouble was that I was thinking of this as a rectangle, and I thought, I want the crinkled edge of the wrapper to stick out about this far from the candy, which it does when it's a rectangle. The problem is that it doesn't when you cinch in these edges, and the reason for that is you really have to kind of factor in the height of it in addition to the excess, because when you take this fabric up around the edge, like wrapping a present, it really just comes and meets, because what I had done was like a half extra on both sides. So I was trying to consider whether I could just have it meet at the edges and then still floof out a little bit there, but it just it wasn't going to be right. So I backtracked and I refigured, and I tried to see if I could just move my smallest one up to the medium fabric and the medium one up to the large fabric, and then just cut a new large fabric, which is roughly what I ended up doing. So instead of my width being twice the size or the diameter of my circle, it's actually 3 times the size, and that allows for it to kind of come up around the edge and then come out by the half diameter, roughly. So this was the original, for example, and this is the final that I ended up doing. And the height I just kept the same, but I increased the width, actually. That's right. So this time it should have more room. I may salvage this for another project, but for this project, it is unfortunately kaput. And the trouble then that I realized is that I had a very limited amount of ribbon. My spool had 21 feet on it. I had used, I think, 14 feet of it for my original cuts, which I had unfortunately done before I realized this issue. So I was able to use most of it and salvage most of it, but I did lose the pieces for the smallest one because those weren't relevant. And because I had already sewn the long edges of this, if I had done the short edges, I would have been able to salvage these long edges, but I couldn't because they were already on there, and I thought I was going to have to rip out all of that sewing, but in the end, I realized that I had just enough, and then I made another mistake where I had my ribbon, so when I sew it on the first edge, it's the full length of that first edge. And then when I sew the second edge, because this has been hemmed by being folded over and folded over again at 1/4 inch increments on both sides, we lose a total of 1 inch, which meant that my short side ribbons were actually 1 inch longer. So using that knowledge and trying to save my ribbon, I cut those short lengths for my small piece at the 10 inches, which is slightly less than my 3 times diameter here. And then, as I was putting together the bigger pieces, I realized that I needed to fold over the ends of these, the short ends, a little just so the ribbon wouldn't fray. And that requires excess. And I was only doing 1 fold, just so I wouldn't get too much fabric at the corners for sewing. But the problem was that I had cut this to 10 inches and it needed to be 10 inches long, and what I needed to do those hems is an extra 1/4 inch on each side, which meant that the total cut needed to be 10 1/2. So I came back to my spool of ribbon and found that I had enough to make one 11 inch, or 10 1/2 inch rather, and that left me with 7 1/2 inches spare, which was not enough to do my final side. So this one actually has a little splice, and all I did was use one of my existing pieces. I cut it a little bit short, and it's got a folded edge here and a short piece with a folded edge. It's not perfect, you can see, but I just continued the sewing across that seam, and nobody's going to notice that. So I'm okay with it. I also had one sloppy corner. It was the first one I did, so I wasn't as good at it. But the rest turned out pretty well, and I'm at the final stage here now of just wrapping them and tying them shut. So it's really like a present here. And I'm planning on using lengths of embroidery floss. If it gives me too much trouble, I can always switch to twisty tie. But I'm going to try the embroidery floss first. And all I'm going to do is fold this in. I'm trying to keep stuff roughly straight. This is where in a present I would use a piece of tape. But I may actually need something in the end at that point to hold it in place. But I'm just going to use a pin for now and see if it's sufficient to allow me to work on the edges. And for good measure, I'm going to put one through both sides of the ribbon. I found also that this crepon fabric is surprisingly forgiving, because right in smack dab in the middle of the big one, which I cut, after I cut it, I realized that there was like a hole in it. And that was very discouraging, because cutting this is a pain. And I will say that on the third one, I did do some measuring and marking before I cut, just because it was so big. But as it turned out, the hole was not damaged threads, like severed threads. It was actually threads that had been, it looked like something had pushed through the fabric by pushing the threads out of the way. So that must mean that this has fairly durable thread. And it just kind of made a hole. So all I had to do is kind of coax those threads to line back up again, and I can't even see where that hole was. I've lost it, which is a great sign. I used the iron too to just kind of affirm that it's where it belonged. So I have my embroidery floss on either side here. I don't have a method figured out, but I think what I'm going to do is just kind of pull on it a little until it comes to a nice crinkly look. And it doesn't have to be all the way tight. So it may take a try or two to figure out what looks right, but it needs to be, pretty snug. Now I'm just going to tie this off, because if I don't like it, I can always cut a new one. Yeah, that seems good. And remember that even though it's going to make a tiny little loop when you're done, you need to have enough to pull on and to tie it off. So cut your string long enough. And you could always use, it doesn't have to be embroidery floss. You could always use thread, or even regular floss would probably work. So I'm just going to tie off the other side, and then we can kind of tweak, because I imagine it will not look perfect on the first try. That would be too easy. Yeah. And you'll notice that my ends kind of stick out, which makes sense because it's flat. It's flat along the back, which means that these are at their longest point. They can stick right out. So to remedy that a little, I'm just going to pull it in on the back. A rounder candy probably wouldn't have that issue. And snip off my remaining embroidery floss, being very, very careful not to cut the fabric. That would be sad. disappointing. And I've had enough sad, disappointing moments from this project already. And there you have one little peppermint. Kind of wish that that these were back a little. I'm just curious what it would look like. You can always sort of modify things as time goes on. I mean, it looks a little bit better. Maybe bundled up like that. I don't know. It's kind of 6 one, half dozen the other. So those are the two options. You could always just pop a pin in there, or even staple it, or throw a few stitches if you wanted to be very permanent about it. But let's go ahead and do the same thing on the larger two. Here's the medium one, and there's no front or back to my fabric. You just want to make sure, that is as far as the seams go, but you do want to make sure that your edges are in the back, not in the front, if you didn't paint both sides of your peppermints. Okay. Whoops. You can always pull it part way too and just tweak a little. Try not to pull too far, but this fabric is so springy. And I am trying to keep these roughly centered. If you have your candy tying off too high or too low, that's not going to look right either. Leave those there for a second. Work on my tweaking. There's the second one. And I will provide, ooh, that's interesting. What have I got on the back of here? I wonder if that's finished from my table. That's exciting. Hold that thought. Odd. Anyways. I will give the final measurements of the fabric that I did along with the diameters that I used, just so if you do this at home, you don't have to go through the same painful learning process that I did. You can jump right to the final product, or at least the final materials. And I'm going to go a little bit longer in these ones here, just so it's easier to work with. Embroidery floss is not expensive, so save myself some trouble. I'm going slightly looser with each tie off, just so it doesn't look weirdly snug on the large ones. They look much larger now that they have this on there, which is true. So if you don't like these dimensions and you're doing this at home, you can always tweak it a little bit. That's the nice bit about doing it yourself. So there is the final product. I'll show you all three of them together. If you're like me, you may find that you like this and the second to last stage. I often find that with craft videos that I watch, that they put on that final touch and I'm like, I liked it better before that final touch. So maybe the wrapper bits are not for you, but the painting is, and that's okay too. But this is the final wrapped candy version of my extra large peppermints. Thanks for supporting Tickled Fancy Crafting by watching this video. Click the like button to let me know that you enjoyed the content and subscribe to see new Tickled Fancy Crafting videos in your feed. If you'd like to be informed directly about the content, ring the notifications bell. Comment with crafts that you would like to see in the future, and remember, you can make this.